Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear friends. Hope you're all well and getting along in these holidays and enjoying your time and also trying to make the best of this time. We start off our youth session today with the topics that you have already been sent. And the first topic that we're going to discuss today relates to the sacrifice which Abraham, our our forefather and the father of the Semitic race, if I may call him, did in his times. And one of the questions that is often brought up, especially by people who have taken to atheism or rejection of God, they don't believe in God, is this issue that why would the Almighty ask for a human sacrifice, and that too from a prophet of God? Remember, he was a prophet of God. He was 86 years old when the Bible says that he was blessed with a child. For 86 long years he waited and prayed to the Almighty for a child, and lo and behold, when he got that child and the child was about 14 or 15 years old, Abraham saw in a dream that he was sacrificing that child. This is something which of course has a lot of import. It has a lot of ring about it, which raises this question. If you leave aside your Muslim or your servitude to God maybe, or your religious fervor towards God, this is a question that should arise in the minds of so many people. And if it has arisen in your mind, so here's the time to discuss it, and I'll try my best to find out for you and the way I understand this sacrifice. And of course, it was a human sacrifice, intendedly a human sacrifice. It never worked, it never proceeded. But then the order from the Almighty Himself, the command from the Almighty that He'd like to, He liked a prophet of God to sacrifice, a human sacrifice, is something which at times does disturb all of us. As I said, this is one of the reasons and one of the pleas for many people who are religious in their background to sort of say that how can a religion be so cruel, and how can God be so cruel as to ask for the sacrifice of one of His prophet's sons. And of course, it was no ordinary an event. And let me tell you before I explain or try to explain this incident that in our Old Testament, of course, the Old Testament, when I speak of the Old Testament, I actually refer to the Torah. The son who was sacrificed according to Torah was Isaac or Ishaq, and not Ishmael, as is contended by Muslims. And though this contention has been refuted convincingly, but the point that is still there is that Isaac also grew up to be a prophet, just as Ishmael did later on. But whether it was Isaac or whether it was Ishmael, the fact remains the same, that supposedly or allegedly the Almighty asked for the sacrifice of a human being. And this is something which is which actually does trouble the mind. That I mean, we are struggling with the concept of animals being slaughtered simply because of the sympathy we have, and we would not like to consume animals for the fact that why should we consume the meat of a living being, even if it is an animal, for our pleasure? So on the one hand, we are still struggling to understand that concept, although we have tried to explain that and its reasoning. But here comes something even more glaring, even more blatant, that a human being is asked to be sacrificed, and he's still a child. He's just a 14-year-old. So imagine, I mean, it really puts my hair, it raises my hair on end on my skin when I imagine this, that if I had a son of 14 years old, a 14-year-old son, and I was an old person in an 80 of an octogenarian, and I would be asked by God to do so, I would have, I don't think I would have been able to do so, and this would have really made me very upset as well. But now let me explain what the Almighty actually had in His mind as is portrayed by the Qur'an, because you see, this sacrifice incident, this slaughter incident, is mentioned in Surah Safat, which is the 37th surah of the Qur'an. You'll not miss the verses, they stand out, and it is here that first of all, Abraham says to Ishmael that he has seen a dream, and if you make consideration of the Arabic language used in the Quran at that instance, you'll find out the dream was shown to Prophet Abraham a number of times. It was not just he saw slaughtering his son or sacrificing his son just once. The words of the Quran actually tell us that he was repeatedly shown this dream, and then he actually tried to act upon the dream, and he actually asked his son Ishmael that this is what I am seeing, and what should I do? And he said, "Faful ma tu'mar," and do what you have been commanded to. This was Ishmael's reply, and both of them set off for this. And we know that when Abraham was about to knife his son, suddenly there was a ram which appeared, and the Almighty said some words, after which the words actually portrayed the fact that God has ransomed his son for this ram or for this sheep, and therefore he need not sacrifice it. Now, there are two things that have to be very, very significantly understood if you need to understand this whole issue of sacrifice or human sacrifice. The first one is that always remember that for the prophets of God, this is stated in the Quran, that for prophets of God, dreams are a means of instruction. They are shown these dreams in order to communicate certain facts of religion, and this is one means. For example, we know that there are other means. We have this direct revelation in which wahi or divine revelation is sent to the heart of a prophet, and he understands the revelation, and in most cases either this revelation is directly on the heart of that prophet, or through an angel, like for example Gabriel would brings these revelations. But one of the ways in which God also instructs his prophets is through these dreams, and we see that these dreams of the prophets have been mentioned in the Quran elsewhere as well. But now the thing that needs to be understood here is that these dreams are always symbolic in nature. They must not be interpreted literally. So just to give you that example, that the prophet Joseph, he saw in his dream, as you might all know from Surah Yusuf, that he saw in his dream that 11 stars and the sun and the moon were actually bowing down in prostration before him. They were prostrating before him. Isn't that? So of course this cannot be taken literally, that the sun and the moon were actually prostrating before the prophet. And the symbolism here was that one day his 11 brothers and his father and mother would submit to his authority, when later he became a virtual king of Egypt. So you see, something which was of the nature of a symbolism was actually later on interpreted to mean so. So all dreams need to be understood on the basis of the symbolism that they convey. They must not be understood literally. I mean, this could not have been true had Joseph interpreted this dream to mean that the sun and the moon and the stars would actually prostrate before him. This cannot be, and this was never the intention. So the first thing that you need to understand is that many of these dreams which are shown to the prophets of God, they have a symbol behind it. They are metaphorical. They have a certain thing to convey. They symbolize certain facts, but they are not to be interpreted literally. If to start interpreting them literally, just as in the case of Joseph, it was impossible. Similarly, here, the intention of the Almighty, let's try to understand that. But a symbolism of that intention was that Abraham was sacrificing his son. This is what he was shown in his dream. And if you view this dream in ancient scriptures and you are able to understand what this sacrifice means when it is seen, especially in the form of a symbolism, it actually means that you are being asked to devote your son to the cause of the Almighty, for the service of the Almighty, for a particular task that the Almighty might have in his mind. So the actual purport of the Almighty, as is evident from these Quranic verses of Surah Safat as well, was that he wanted Abraham to dedicate his son Ishmael for the construction of the Holy Kaaba, which of course they did, and for dedicating himself to be the custodian of that shrine, the Holy Kaaba. And this dedication was meant that Ishmael should not be given a normal professional life, which in those times would be to look after herds, or maybe cultivate land and similar things. So the symbolism was that the Almighty wanted His Son to be devoted for God Himself. This is what the symbolism was. And this is very evident when God Himself exclaimed, when Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, He said, "Qad saddaqta ru'ya." Abraham, you have made your dream come true. This was not required. You are acting literally upon the dream. This was actually a test for you in which the Almighty wanted to see whether you do this as a literal interpretation or you interpret it metaphorically. So, as far as the Almighty Himself was concerned, He wanted this metaphorical message to be conveyed to Abraham to devote and dedicate his son. And Abraham, instead of interpreting it, he took it literally. And God said that this made him even more happy because in this huge test, he did not go for an interpretation, he acted literally. So, this is how God praised him on the one hand, and on the other hand, corrected him also that this was not required. But what you've done is something even beyond that was what was required. So, this is a very important area, my dear friends and students here, that you need to understand that the sacrifice offered by Abraham, if it is understood the way it is described in the Qur'an, one gets this true feeling that it was basically a dedication of Ishmael for the service of the Almighty. So, when you slaughter your son in the way of God, it's like just dedicating that son for the servitude of the Almighty, for the tasks which the Almighty would actually allocate for that child. So, this is the explanation which the Quran has offered, and I dare say it was first put forward 100 years ago by a very eminent Quranic scholar of the subcontinent. His name is Hamiduddin Farahi, and he was a scholar of ancient scriptures as well as a scholar of the Quran, and he said, look, what the Quran is saying is something so different that what we are actually interpreting it normally in so many centuries. The symbolism in the Quran, the words of the Quran are so evident when the Almighty says, "Qad saddaqta ru'ya," which means, Abraham, you have made your dream come true, which actually meant that you acting upon your dream was not the need, it was not required. What was required was that you get this message from me, from God, that please don't use Ishmael for these worldly chores and these other means of livelihood. Just dedicate him to my house. So, you see, this is how this sacrifice has to be explained. And if you explain it in this manner, you can clearly see that the Almighty never asked for a human sacrifice. This was a dream, and dreams need to be interpreted. They are always in the form of symbols and allegories, and that symbolism has to be understood. And if in case I have been able to, or successfully able to, put across this interpretation, then you need to understand that the Almighty never ever asked for a human being to be sacrificed. He actually just wanted Abraham to devote his son to the cause of the Almighty. Right. Next, we go on to the second part of our circle of this session, and that is the stigma of terrorism. And I think this is something which all of you might have experienced in one way or the other in various gatherings. It could be your friends, it could be your non-Muslim friends, even your Muslim friends who would really be worried that why is it that Muslims are so violent, and why is it that we find them killing people all over the world and making themselves called as terrorists, and not only terrorists but Islamic terrorists. And the reason for this is that they use certain verses of the Quran. See, it's not that they are just perpetrated an act of violence in the name of their own ambition. No, that is not so. They actually quote certain Quranic verses, which, for example, there are verses to this effect that strike off the heads of the disbelievers or fight with the disbelievers. So this is what these verses are, the ones that they quote, and then say that it is their divine responsibility, it is the responsibility which God has imposed upon them to kill non-believers and to chop off their heads. And this is actually something that we find in their literature. So if you read the literature of the Taliban, for example, or the Al-Qaeda or their splinter groups, they always have a scholarly wing which issues these fatwas or these edicts which say that you have to fight these idolaters and these people who are non-believers. And in 1994, there was this famous gathering of people in Afghanistan in which Osama bin Laden, at that time, had not become very famous. So when he emerged, he was still the leader, of course, but he was not that famous. So when he emerged from that meeting, he actually cited a Quranic verse which said, "Qatilu a'immatul kufr." And while pointing to the United States, he said, well, the Quran tells us to kill the leaders of disbelief, or the leaders of these non-believers. And to me, the number one leader of these non-believers is the United States of America. So I'm going to wage war. So this is what he warned many years before the 9/11 attacks. Almost 7 years, and this is what he planned. So of course there are these stories, or these theories, I would say, which say that he did not do so, and there are all kinds of explanations. But let me tell you that let's not go into the details of the history, but what I can tell you is that people do kill in the name of God, and this has become a habit of a lot of people who train themselves in warfare, in weaponry, and then they kill various non-Muslims. And one of the biggest reasons that they cite is that this is the order which the Quran has given them. So let us try to understand what the Quran has actually said, and why is it being repeatedly misinterpreted, because it never says that you kill innocent people, or you start bombing them, or you conduct these suicide raids and these suicide bombings. So I'm just I'll try to very briefly explain what exactly the Quran says regarding the infidels or the non-believers. And yes, there are verses in the Quran which do say that strike off the heads of these non-believers, of these infidels, but they have a very, very specific context. Unfortunately, what has happened is that they have been interpreted out of their context, and something which was specific to messengers of God was erroneously extrapolated and extended for all times to come. Now you see, the basic thing that we need to understand here is that the Almighty, in the times of His messengers, He has a certain plan to implement, and that is that He actually creates a miniature day of judgment in the life of His messengers, so that miniature day of judgment is going to corroborate that greater day of judgment, the Qiyamah, which is going to take place in the hereafter. So the thing is that because of the fact we people often we ignore this accountability of the hereafter. So one of the visual proofs that accountability is going to take place in the hereafter, that day of judgment is going to take place one day, what happens is that the Almighty creates these miniature days of judgments in the times of His messengers. So we can call them the lesser days of judgment. Just as there's a greater day of judgment, this was this lesser day of judgment which took place in the life of His messengers. And this happens that God, on His own behalf, He selects His messengers, He conveys through these messengers the truth to the nations in which these messengers are sent, and they are given this opportunity to reflect on the message. And if they start to intentionally deny the message, which of course relates to the fact that there is one God and that you will be held accountable on the basis of your deeds, and this will take place on the day of judgment. So this 3-point agenda, God being one, accountability on the basis of your deeds, and number 3, that this is going to take place one day on the day of judgment. This is the agenda which every messenger of God conveys to his nation, and they are given time to reflect on this. But once they deny, and remember, this denial is never because of any confusion, never because of any lack of information or anything else. It is that they understand what the messenger has said, because the Almighty is behind his messengers in conveying the truth. And the Quran states that this happens once they understand the message and out of arrogance say that we are not going to understand it, or we are not going to follow it. So it is here the Almighty punishes them, and the punishment that He metes out is that He normally destroys them from the face of the earth, as is the case with so many messengers. So we see the nation of Lot, the nation of Shu'aib, the Ad, the Samud, they were all destroyed and wiped out from the face of the earth because they had deliberately, and my dear friends, do note this word, deliberate. And deliberate means that they know what the truth is, but out of arrogance they say nothing doing, we're not going to follow it. So it is here that the Almighty takes this action and He destroys nations. And the methodology of this destruction is that generally nations who adhere to polytheism, who are idolaters, they are wiped out from the face of the earth, and they have given this opportunity either to mend their ways or face the music. And the other denomination are the monotheists. So they are spared their lives if they are willing to live in subjugation to the Islamic authority. So these are the two punishments which are given generally, and this is what the Qur'an actually says. The Qur'an says that the punishment of polytheism in the hereafter is that it shall not be forgiven, and people shall be burnt in hell for being polytheistic. So the same punishment goes in this world, that people who are polytheistic, they are given this punishment of death, because this is what they're going to face in the hereafter, and it is just this punishment in this world is just a prelude to that punishment. And it is not that they are denying God out of any confusion, as I said, or any lack of information, but they are fully cognizant, they are fully convinced that there is one God, and they are fully convinced that the prophet they are now facing is a true prophet, but out of arrogance or out of other worldly interests, they decide to deny the prophet, and hence this punishment is given. But remember, this is something which is a prerogative of the messengers of God, because the Almighty has actually said that this rule will only apply to these miniature days of judgment which take place in the times of His messengers, because just as He's going to punish people in the hereafter Himself, which is what God says, He's going to punish people for the same crimes in this world, but only in the era of the messengers of God. Why? Because this deliberate denial can only be known by the Almighty, can only be disclosed by the Almighty. So when the Wahi is still operational, God is able to communicate His message to His prophets and tell them that these are the people who have intentionally denied, so therefore they have to be taken to task. And because of the fact that the Almighty Himself is explaining the truth through His messengers, so therefore this is something which cannot happen in later times. So after the Prophet Muhammad's departure, neither does God communicate to people to tell them who has intentionally denied, because you see, intentional denial is something that belongs to the heart. You cannot judge it from a person's actions. Today, therefore, when you see someone denying accountability or denying God, you don't know whether that denial is because of any lack of information, because of any confusion, or even because of the bad deeds of Muslims themselves. But this denial is known in the times of messengers of God, because it is God who communicates this denial to His prophets. And therefore, they are given this directive that they can now punish them. Because of the fact that this denial today cannot be pinpointed, because we don't have the institution of Wahi. Denial relates to your heart, your intention, and one cannot find one's intention unless one is God. And God, in the times of His messengers, communicated this intention to His messengers that such and such a group is bent upon intentional denial, and the punishment which was reserved for them in the hereafter is now going to be given in this world because of this arrogance of theirs. But as soon as the prophets of God pass away, as soon as the messengers of God pass away, this is no longer possible, because now God has stopped communicating to people, and also there is, in the absence of a messenger of God, the clarity with which this message could have been conveyed cannot be conveyed by people like us. So in fact, what has happened is that there was a certain law of the Almighty mentioned in the Qur'an only for the messengers of God, and it was God Himself who punished these people through these messengers, just as He's going to do that in the hereafter. So once these messengers passed away, that law also went away with them, but the whole incident of these miniature days of judgment was preserved in the Qur'an, so that for us who are people who are living after the Prophet Muhammad can always refer back to those incidents and say, look, these nations denied their prophets and messengers intentionally, and they were punished in this world either by God Himself through natural disasters or through the swords of the disbelievers. So if we do the same thing, we shall be given the same fate as well. The only thing is that our fate is being deferred to the day of judgment. See? So for people of the nations of God, before prophethood had ended, their fate was decided in this very world, and it would continue for the next world, the day of judgment. But for post-prophetic periods, which means that after the Prophet Muhammad passed away, we would also suffer the same fate if we do what they are doing. But our fate has been deferred to the day of judgment, because on that day the Almighty will tell us what we had done. And in this world He does not do so, because in the absence of the institution of Wahi, He cannot. He has stopped doing so. So what has happened is that people like Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar and the likes of them, they have picked up something which was a prerogative of God Himself, which He implemented in the times of His messengers, and all these verses actually related to those messengers of God in their own times. They started to implement these verses of the Prophet by themselves, without realizing that they were reserved specifically for messengers of God, because they were acting on behalf of God. It was in fact as if God Himself was doing something. But once these messengers have passed away, this practice is no longer in force, because that was something which only happened in the days of God. We no longer have those miniature days of judgment that we used to have in the times of the messengers of God. So we can clearly see that if this is the case, then what has happened is that verses which were specific for God's messengers have been wrongly being used by people like Osama bin Laden and his likes for their own selves, and without realizing that this was just the prerogative of God's messengers. And in this way they are inadvertently guilty of playing God. You see, something which only God sanctioned in the time of His messengers, and He'll do in later times as well on the day of judgment. This post-prophetic era from Muhammad till the day of judgment is going to be an era in which no such thing is happening, in which we have been authorized to punish people for any denial. This is the job of God. He did so in the time of His messengers, and He's going to do it again on the day of judgment. But we are not authorized. Today, our relations with all non-Muslims have to be cordial. We have to consider them to be our brethren. We have to communicate what the truth is, what the prophets of God did. The only thing was that in the times of the messengers of God, this communication culminated in a miniature day of judgment. But in our times, it cannot culminate in a miniature day of judgment. In our times, we have to do what we are supposed to do, and the judgment is going to take place on the day of judgment. So I hope I have tried my best to sort of communicate it. And of course, you should have a lot of questions on this, but in order to understand that why these Quranic verses speak of chopping off the heads of non-believers or speak of the wrath of God, it is because they relate to the law of the messengers of God, and it is as if God Himself is conveying His tremendous anger that these are the people who have denied out of this intent, and now they deserve this punishment. So we have wrongly extrapolated a law which was meant for messengers and adopted it ourselves. Right. So I'll now move on to the third segment of our study circle or our youth session, and that is regarding some of the events which are taking place in this world in the recent past. Thus, we have the issue of the Hindu temple in Pakistan being sanctioned by the government itself and providing funds for that. And then we have the Hagia Sofia issue, which is still burning, and a lot of things are being said all around it. And even, I think it was last Friday when the first Friday prayer was held after a long time, and the Turkish president himself is supposed to have recited certain verses, and he was very happy to have it opened and converted to a mosque. So let's start off with the first of these issues, and that is the building or construction of a Hindu temple in Muslim areas. So you see, in order to understand this confusion which has arisen is again because of there are certain narratives which are found in our Hadith literature, which say that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for example, said that I have been sent to break these idols. I am going to destroy these idols. This is my primary task. And for example, in the Kaaba, there were 360 idols, and once Mecca was conquered, the Prophet ordered for their destruction. And this actually, this act of the Prophet is taken to mean that therefore we cannot sanction the building of these temples, because the Prophet himself was someone who destroyed these temples in the land of Arabia. So how can we do something which the Prophet did not do? Or he did and he stopped us from. And on a very similar basis, the Taliban destroyed the Bamiyan statues in Afghanistan about 2 decades ago, and they give the same reasoning that we will not allow these statues to stand and these idols to stand, because idol worship has been condemned all over in the Qur'an, and the Prophet himself is the person who actually went about destroying these statues. So here I need to explain something more to you so that you are able to understand that why is this dichotomy, that if the Prophet has actually ordered for the destruction, that why is it that Muslims, wherever they went, I'm not talking about the present era when this dispute has arisen, but there is this this historical evidence that all over the world, wherever Muslims were, they actually gave protection to temples, to synagogues, to churches, and they allowed all non-believers to worship the way they want to, even build idols, even prostrate before those idols. So it is here to understand something very important, my dear friends, and please do concentrate what I'm just going to tell you. And that is the Almighty has given a very special place and status to the land of Arabia. And for the land of Arabia, the law is, according to the Quran and according to the Hadith, that nothing which is against monotheism will be allowed there. No churches will be allowed to be built there, except if it's a temporary sort of a thing for example, ambassadors or people who are visiting there. But no permanent structure, whether it's a temple, whether it's a synagogue, whether it's a church, shall be built just in the land of Arabia. And this rule is distinct from all other parts of the world. Why? Because the Almighty wanted to set up a model territory which reflects monotheism. And before this Arabian territory, he gave this status to the territory of Canaan or Palestine. So there were two centers of monotheism which the Almighty wanted to demark as centers of monotheism where nothing polytheistic would enter. And therefore, for the land of Arabia, the order was that no statues, no idols would be tolerated there, because as this famous prophetic narrative is, La yajtami'u fihi dinan, which means that two religions cannot combine themselves in Arabia, which meant that only Islam can prevail. But this was just for the Arabian Peninsula, so that there is one model territory in the whole world where only and only monotheism exists, nothing but monotheism. But for the rest of the world, the law was entirely different. And for the rest of the world, wherever the Sahaba went, they tolerated all other religions. They let them live as protected minorities. In Saudi Arabia or in Arabia also, they can live as protected minorities, but they cannot live there permanently or live with these structures of their worship places permanently. Maybe they can have a prayer place in their embassies or their places where they live, but a full-fledged structure of a mosque, of a church, not a mosque, of a church or a synagogue or a temple cannot be constructed there. So this law again was just meant for the Arabian Peninsula. So that is why wherever the Sahaba went after beyond the Arabian Peninsula, they conquered Persia, you know, they conquered Rome, they went to all parts, outskirts of the world, and a better part of the world was conquered in those times. But in all those places, they never ever obliterated the temples or the worship places of any religion. And today, because we're not living in Arabia, of course, we're living in a country like Pakistan, and maybe you are living in a place like Singapore or Malaysia or any other place. In all these territories, in all other territories except for Arabia, the rule is that whatever worship places they are able to build and able to follow, they shall be completely allowed. In fact, government shall give funds for that. It will provide them with this protection. They are free to worship in their temples and in their synagogues and in their churches. So this misconception has arisen by not realizing the fact that the law for Arabia was something different than it is for the rest of the world. For the rest of the world, all non-Muslims can live as protected minorities, as I just said, but the rule would be that they can build their own places of worship. It is only in Arabia that this has been not allowed by the Prophet. So what has happened is that a rule which was specifically meant for the land of Arabia has wrongly been extended by some of the people to other parts of the world, and therefore now they think that maybe these people can build their own temples, but the government cannot sanction these temples. So again, I think there is a contradiction here, that if these temples can be built by their own money, That means that you're actually still allowing the temples to be built. The only thing is that you're not allowing public funding for that money. So that doesn't make a difference, and it's like a contradiction. If temples are allowed, whether you're by your own money or by the money of these government officials or this government, it would mean that you're still allowing these temples. The only thing is that you're objecting that who is financing them. So as I said, this financing or anything else, I mean, non-Muslims can finance them themselves, the government can do so, there is no restriction on that. But the bottom line is that we have to understand that the restrictions which exist in Arabia are entirely specific to the land of Arabia, and they cannot be extended to other territories. And by not understanding this distinction between the specific status of Arabia and the rest of the world, this confusion is now happening, and we are not very clear about it. So I just wanted that this should be very clear to you. Now, the second part of this segment is, of course, the fact that what's going on at the Hagia Sofia, and this is something which has happened in the last 2 weeks or so. And we all know that it was a Greek Orthodox church for 1,000 years, for 1,000 years. And it was only in 1453 AD, we are told, that when the Turks conquered Constantine, which is, of course, the name was given. The name was given as Constantinople. It was Byzantium, and the original name was Byzantium. But later on, it was given the name of Constantinople, and it was then that this Hagia Sophia was changed from a church to a mosque. And it is said, history has preserved 2 accounts of this. So there is one branch of people who say that it was the Sultan Muhammad had actually bought this church from the Greek Orthodoxy. He had paid money for that, and the documents these people claim that exist, which show that it was something which was bought, and hence, if it was bought, then therefore converting into a mosque is something very legal, because it was never forced upon them. Out of their own intention and out of their own will, they gave up this mosque, and they actually earned money out of it. And this is how Sultan Muhammad actually converted it into a mosque. And then in the 1930s, when Mustafa Kemal Pasha was there, he actually converted it into a library, because he wanted to obliterate and take out all the means of religion in his own times to serve his own ideology of secularism. And this happened in 1934 or 35. And now in 2020, the court has ruled that the library or the museum should be converted back to its original status of a mosque. So by doing so, if this is correct, that the mosque was actually bought by Sultan Muhammad, and he did not force the church authorities to give up their church, so they can say, well, they have done the right thing as far as the legal part is concerned. They have not done something wrong, because if Sultan Muhammad purchased something and converted into a mosque, even if it was a church, then he did so out of not forcing those people to give up the church, by buying the church and converting into a mosque. So if this mosque is being reverted to its original shape, then this is what their courts have ordered, that it would be perfectly okay. Because as I said, that the legal cover is there. Legally, it was a mosque. It was bought and converted into a mosque, and now it's being brought back to its original form. But my own personal understanding, and there is of course a whole group of people who say that this was not the case, that the Sultan actually bought this mosque. He forced the church authorities, because of his stature and his position, to give up the mosque, though he had even paid for the mosque. But it was like something that they had to do. They did not do it out of their free will. I mean, it's like saying that, well, you have to resign or I'll turn you out. So it's better that you resign. So it's like saying that, well, you have to give up the mosque. It's better have some money in exchange of it and make it look like a deal. So whatever the situation, I cannot ratify either of the 2 stances, whether it was bought out of free will, or whether it was bought out of coercion, or whether it was not even bought and forcibly converted into a mosque. All these scenarios could be possible, and this needs further research in historical documents. But my personal view would be that if only Sultan Muhammad had not done so, even if he had the opportunity to do so, I think it would have been in the fitness of things to keep it intact as a church, because it remained a church for 1,000 years. And something which has such a sanctity attached to it and emotions attached to it, why should a person go against it? Imagine if you of Muslims, they are forced to convert for example, the Blue Museum or the Blue Mosque in Turkey to a church. If some warring person comes in and he purchases that, and for so many years we find that the Blue Mosque has been remained a mosque, our own emotions would have been hurt, of course. So I think, though the Turkish authorities may have had this legal cover that they are doing the right thing because there are documents which exist which say that it was out of their own free will that the mosque was purchased or the place was purchased, my own perception is that I wish that Sultan Muhammad had not done so. And today, if the church authority, these Turkish authorities had to take a stance, it would have been much better if they had reverted it back to its church status, not its mosque status, because that was its original status. You just cannot obliterate history. It could have become a place of visitation. People could have regarded to be a church the way, of course, there are. And you can see that there are so many other mosques all around in Turkey. Why is it that we are after converting a place which has a historical importance into something which has emotions attached to it by some other community? So we know even today that the Greek authorities are very annoyed on this whole issue, and they think that they have been wronged and they have been humiliated because their church has been converted into another worship place. So, having said all this, my own personal view is that I just wish that this had happened, that our Turks would have realized this, that they have so many other mosques in Turkey. They could have just given this back to the Greeks or the Greek Orthodox Church. They would have won the hearts of this world. They would have won the hearts of this world. And instead, now they have ended up breaking the hearts of so many people and winning the hearts of a few Muslims. I only wish that this had not happened. But anyway, I don't matter. We are of course just giving this view. But what has happened has already happened. We can only lament and mourn that, but nothing much perhaps can be done. Right. So now we come to the fourth and final part of our youth segment, and this is the issue of self-gratification or masturbation, which is something which every young person is faced with. Whether you do it or not is something, of course, every person knows, but every person has this urge to do it. So how does religion view this act? This is what I'm just going to try to explain. Now, before I go on to explain this, you see, one thing that we need to realize is that sexual urge is something which is a naturally arisen phenomenon. It's a biological thing. So at puberty, when you enter this adolescence age, you need not feel that guilt which at times people do feel that maybe this is something wrong. No, it's like being thirsty, it's like being hungry. So your body has this thirst for sex, and this is how that sexual urge arises naturally from within you. And there could be that there is an environment outside you which actually stimulates this urge even further because of various things which are present. We all know those. And this happens that whatever your internally stimulated sexual urge, it is multiplied many times because of the external factors which are there. Now, there is nothing wrong with this sexual urge being there, and of course, it's like, as I said, it's a natural thirst that you have. You have to quench that thirst, and if you don't quench that thirst, of course, you'll end up doing something which is absolutely prohibited. Thus, for example, the right way of quenching that thirst would be to get married and therefore be in a position to do that. But this is not possible in these current circumstances, and neither it was in many eras of the world. You just cannot get married at puberty. So there is this about 10 or 15 or maybe 20-year period once you enter this sexual urge age and the time that you get married. So these 10, 15 years in which this urge is supposed to be the strongest, you are actually left high and dry what to do with it, how to satisfy it, and how can you go about trying to mitigate it. So I would say that this is one area where the directive of religion has been grossly misunderstood. There is not a single verse in the Qur'an, in my humble study, and there is not a single authentic narrative in the hadith literature of the Prophet which prohibits this act. There is nothing which prohibits masturbation. It is something that you can do if you want to, if you're not able to mitigate your urge from other areas. For example, I do encourage all young people that they should have lives which have a mission. They should focus on an objective in life. You see, when you're vacant and you don't have anything to do, this urge multiplies, and this urge actually is something which can take you to a lot of extremes. So if you have a life in which you concentrate on your objective, if you have a life in which you actually restrain your gaze from taking undue liberty, you guard your eyesight from taking undue liberty, you guard your chastity, you are a modest person, you're a bashful person. If all these things they are going on in yourself, and of course, if in spite of these things that you're trying to restrain yourself, if you feel like releasing your sexual urge, there is nothing in the Qur'an or the Hadith which prohibits it. Of course, the prohibition is something which I would say in this regard, that pornography or viewing things which stimulate this sexual desire is uncalled for. This is something which should not be done. But any naturally arisen desire which you are not able to control, if you release it through masturbation, there is absolutely nothing which stops. Even I have even quoted, I think, when I wrote this article somewhere, that in the times, the scholars of our Muslim Ummah have cited some of the authorities from the Sahaba and from their students, that the Sahaba and the students would say something to this effect: well, this is your water. If you waste your water, it's your fluid. You're wasting. It's up to you. There's nothing wrong in it. So this is the Arab way of actually telling people, well, there's nothing prohibited in that particular area. So because of the fact that this has become a taboo question, because of the fact that this is something which is seldom discussed, I mean, there are so many people who would do it, but they would not confess to it, and they would feel the guilt that they are doing something wrong. So I think this needs to be understood. There should be no guilt involved. If ever there is a guilt, it should be that you should not do things which stimulate your sexual desire, like as I said, watching pornography or doing things or letting your eyes take that liberty in staring the opposite gender, the physical attributes of the opposite gender. These are something that you need to avoid. But in spite of what's going on, if you have that natural urge to release your desire, this is nothing which stops us from doing so. And there are so many, practical areas in which this has been recommended as well. Because, for example, when you get married, there are issues in which a wife and a husband, they are not always in a position to satisfy each other's desires. I mean, one could be a person who's desiring that sexual act, and the other person is not there for that person. Either maybe he or she is traveling, or he or she is not in the proper mood. Then what is the other person to be doing? Is he or she going to wait for the other person? But of course, that is at times not possible. So you see, even in married life, even in life in which you have a partner which is a justified partner, that you can satisfy your sexual urge, even in those times, at times it is not possible. At times there are men and women living apart. For example, they are doing jobs in different cities or countries, but they are married. And in that case, of course, again, this is something which is not possible. So much for married people, but I'm at the moment concentrating about people who are yet to get married. Whatever they do, they must not feel that guilt. They should avoid those things which I have just said. But as far the act itself is concerned, there is no religious, I take this responsibility, I state this with full responsibility. There's nothing in the Quran, nothing in the Hadith which goes against it. And if you have anything in your mind, or maybe you have been cited something by some scholar, or maybe you have picked up something from the internet, do share it with me, because I have gone through all that literature, and we have categorized that all hadiths, all narratives which stop us or stop people from doing it, they have been classified as za'if or weak or inauthentic from the Prophet. And as I said, the Quran itself has nothing to say about it. There is nothing which is mentioned in the Quran which stops masturbation. So I now come to an end on this youth session. I do hope that you must be having a lot of questions, or if you are not willing to, ask them face to face, it's perfectly okay. If you write those questions, or even if you wish, you can just privately message me. If there are, of course, there are issues which person is not comfortable in discussing openly, then do remember that I'm always there if you have a question on a personal level. So thank you very much. I now hand over the mic to our co-host, Madam Ghazal.
start taking the questions, I have a small important announcement to make that we will not have session next Sunday. We'll be celebrating Eid al-Adha, so just wishing you Eid in advance. And we'll resume our session from August 9th. I'll be sending an email as a reminder as well, and it will be posted on the group chat as well. So please take note of that. So let's move forward. And first question is from Ahmed Shoaib. So Ahmed, please go ahead and ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. I wanted to ask that is there a religious prohibition or something that stops us from spending our own personal money on building like a Hindu temple? Because the same way when we build a masjid, we get good deeds when people pray. We are kind of allowing or enabling someone to do shirk. So isn't that a wrong thing?
I don't think so, because you see, it could be wrong for us, but it's like sharing something which a minority is doing. I mean, if you're living in a place and, for example, someone comes to your doorstep and knocks at your door and says that we want a donation for a church or a temple or a synagogue, I think if you are in a position to give that donation, you should, because you see, what you're doing here is you're not promoting something which is irreligious. What you're doing is you're promoting this right of having a religion and practicing it according to one's own beliefs. So you're allowing Christians and Jews and Hindus and other people that they have this right to worship God in the manner they want to. We don't agree with it, therefore we don't go to these temples. But we say that it is their right to have these temples. So, I mean, there can be two opinions about it, but if you ask my opinion, I am in a position to help out a temple or a mosque or a church to be built, I'll do so.
Okay, yes, sir, that makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you. Minnie, you are next. Please ask your question.
I actually have like 3 questions. Is that okay? Or do I go one by one?
I will appreciate if you go one by one.
Sure.
Give your hand afterwards. Yeah.
Gotcha. So the first one is, do the rules of sex also apply on masturbation? So like showering afterwards or stuff like that, basically?
Yes. You see, whenever there is an ejaculation, you are required to have a bath to become ceremonially and ritually clean. The same rules will apply.
So, like in case of women, you're not ejaculating, but you're orgasming.
Of course.
If you reach that state, does that work the same way?
Yeah, it does. When I said ejaculation, you see, orgasm itself is a form of internal ejaculation. So it's I was speaking in that term. But yes, if they do so, they have to have a ceremonial bath.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Samin and Mahin, you are up next. So go ahead, ask your question.
Yeah, so I had a question about the second part. So many like Islamic terrorist parties, they don't just attack like non-believers. Many attack their fellow Muslim like brothers and sisters as well. Like an example is, the attack in Kabul that was, apparently done by the Taliban. So how do they justify that, or what's their reasoning behind that?
So what happens is that they first declare them as non-Muslims. They say that they have committed disbelief, they are no longer Muslims, they have done such and such things which have actually taken them out of the folds of Islam, and they are now, it's like saying that they are now free to be killed. They have left the fold of Islam. So they issue a fatwa or an edict which first declares them as kafir, which say that they are no longer Muslims now, and hence they can be treated in the same way as other non-believers can.
Thank you. Ibrahim Malik, you're up next. Please ask your question.
Thank you. I have only one question regarding part 3. According to you, would you encourage people like me to attend mass and prayers of churches and other structures of other religions?
Yes, I would. I do this personally. Whenever I get a chance, I go to a church on Sundays in the morning just to observe what's happening, because not everything that is happening is idolatrous or polytheistic in nature. They have many things which they I mean, pronounce or they read out. For example, there's when many hymns. There is this recital of the Psalms, which is perfectly, I mean, it's really exhilarating, it's really invigorating. So, for example, to observe them, and at times when whatever they are reciting is in line with our beliefs, it's really a pleasure to go there. So whenever I get the chance, I do so, and I can give you this personal experience that I once had in London. I attended a mass in St. Paul's Cathedral, and it was one of the best experiences of my life. And this was the time that women priests had just been inducted. I mean, they had not been inducted, but they were beginning to be looked upon as if they can be part of these church ceremonies. So it happened that in St. Paul's Cathedral, if you've been there, any of you have gone there, can tell that there is this this arena, huge arena, beyond which the observers cannot go inside, but they can watch what's happening. So, being standing right behind that line and watching what was going on, it was an out of this world experience for me. There were some things which they, of course, recited, which meant that they were invoking Jesus as the Son of God. But to them, for me, it was just I knew what's going to happen. I was not going to, of course, support them, but just as for my own education and just to learn how they conduct their ceremonies, it was a very, very enjoyable experience for me. And I have been doing this whenever I get the chance. So yes, I would say do go. I think in Malaysia I was able to go to a temple, in fact to 4 or 5 temples, Hindu temples, and I saw all their statues and their gods, the way they had displayed them. There are so many statues and in so many temples in Malaysia. I'm sure there are many in Singapore as well, because of the existence of the Buddhist community and the Hindu community there. So I also went to a Buddhist temple. So I do enjoy going to all these worship places and see how they worship, and even take part in those areas of their worship which to me are absolutely monotheistic.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Ikra Sakhtar, you are up next. Please ask your question.
Assalamualaikum, sir.
Walaikum.
Sir, my question is from the segment 2, that is Stigma of Terrorism. Like people like Osama bin Laden and Mullah Umar, but they get the good intention, like they use Quranic verses. Who is responsible for their misguidance? Like who is we call them wrong, but they also did it with good intention, and it was their obtained knowledge. They must got the knowledge from some scholar or wherever. But my question is, who is responsible for their misguidance?
Actually, you see, what we call as misguidance, it is guidance for them. They think it's guidance. And what I just said is the belief which is taught in all the madrasas. What I just said, that something which was meant for the prophets and messengers of God and is wrongly being extended to all other people. This is not just Mullah Omar and Osama bin Laden. They were the activists among those people, and they took the initiative and did what they did. But as an ideology, this is what every madrasa teaches, that infidels have to be dealt with in a certain way. Infidels have to be conquered. For example, every madrasa, every religious seminary of the Muslims tells or teaches the students that Islam has to be the global religion. You have to conquer the rest of the world. All of the people have to live in subservience. They cannot live as independent countries. They must live below the flag of Islam. This is what is taught in our madrasas, and this is what they have interpreted from what the Prophet did according to them. So it's not just a case of a few people doing so, it's a whole chain of maybe 12 centuries in which this is what is being taught in our madrasas. And as I said, this is something which has taken its toll, and unfortunately even today our traditional approach is the same. Mullah Omars and Osama bin Ladens will continue to arise, and they'll continue to be born because of the fact that this is what is still being taught in our madrasas. So I would say that for this we have to present this counter narrative or this alternative picture to the silent majority, people like you, young people like you, who would understand what the reasoning of the Quran is. And personally, me, myself, my colleagues and my teachers, we also try to engage in dialogue with religious people who teach this ideology and try to engage them and try to tell them that this is a misplaced thing that they are doing. But unfortunately, what happens is that we may be successful to some extent with people like you because you're open to reason and discussion. Unfortunately, our clergy is not open to discussion and reasoning. So what reason or what opinion they have once formed remains with them, and they are not willing to revisit or revise that because they've just shut their minds and they've just thought over that whatever they've understood is correct. So we are not very successful on their front, but what we are trying is to educate people on this counter interpretation of these Quranic verses and these hadith directives. And we've been doing this for the past almost 20 years, and I've lost two of my colleagues. So one was murdered, both were doctors, one in one city, another in another city. So these Taliban came in the garb of patients. They had a gun hidden, and they just murdered one of them in one city, and some time later on they actually did so in another city, one of my doctor colleagues, and a third one was also shot, but he survived. So you see, what we are trying to do is we are taking these risks as well, and at the same time trying to educate people. And I think there's nothing more that we can do. And what I expect from people like you, young people like you, is that you understand this ideology. If you agree with it, of course, we don't want to force on you. But if you agree with this, then you become proponents of this ideology, start discussing it amongst educated people like yourself and like your friends, so that people are able to know the other picture as well.
All right, sir. Thank you very much for such a detailed answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is by Zain. Zain, please go ahead, ask your question.
Hello.
We can hear you.
So I had a question regarding your example of Hazrat Ismail and Hazrat Ibrahim and this idea of a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
So I find myself confused as to why Allah uses so much allegory and metaphor and these sort of complex rhetorical devices in the Quran, because I feel that a large majority of Muslims are uneducated and illiterate, either in terms of their understanding of the Quran or in general. So then why does involving such a complex group of ideas and a doctrine that we're supposed to follow throughout our lives, why does he employ these could be perceived as confusing methods to get across a point? Wouldn't it be better if he's just way more blunt?
Well, don't you think that you need to pose this question to God? I mean,
yeah.
I can try to answer it, but I mean, he has done something and we are on the receiving end. So I think the explanation that I have in my mind is that the Quran is a piece of literature. It's a piece of outstanding literature in which things are conveyed, in which ideas are conveyed in a literary format. And the Quran has actually two levels of that. For a plain reader, for a simple reader who reads any translation that he or she can pick up in any language, it has a very basic message for all of us, which can be easily understood and deciphered by one and all. And that is why the Quran itself dubs itself by saying Hudal Linnas. It is guidance for all mankind. So that basic guidance level is available for every single person. Now there are certain nuances, certain things of wisdom, certain things which are hidden deeply. They are the ones which the Quran employs, and of course they are a subject of debate as well. But then this is how God works. He says that there are two levels of people. There are people who are very simple in their approach, they just need a simple translation. There are other people who are fond of deliberation, reflection, and going deep into things. For them, of course, the Quran is a book that needs to be reflected upon, deliberated upon, so that they can quench their thirst of deliberation. People of higher intellect, for them a basic message would have been very bland and not very challenging and not very involving. So these two levels exist in the Quran, in which that basic guidance is available for everyone, and that higher form, more deeper form, is there for the scholars and for advanced students, so that they can go deeper and find out something which is more appropriate and that can satisfy their own intellect. So because the Quran was revealed for both these types of people, and both these types of people exist, okay, had it been very literary, the common man would have not been understood it properly. And had it been only a simple statement, the people who have higher intelligence or more intellect would not have been, comfortable or enjoyed reading it. So to cater for both these levels of intelligence in mankind, this was how the Quran actually, I would say, I can be wrong, but this is how I think, that this is how the Almighty planned it to satisfy people at all levels. But as I said, for that basic level, this metaphor and this allegory and these similes and parables, they don't have that. I mean, they have a simple meaning as well, and when they have that simple meaning, that is enough to satisfy the intellect of such people. But again, this question is actually need to be, I mean, when you go there one day, inshallah, and you meet him, do ask this question. I'll be with you,
Yeah, sure.
hopefully, to ask this.
Hopefully. Hopefully.
Thank you so much. Hamza Ahmed, you are next. Please go ahead, ask your question.
Thank you, ma'am. I have two questions, so I should ask one by one or go ahead together?
I would appreciate it one by one. Thank you.
The first question is, sir, there are two narratives about the days of slaughter. Some say that there are 3 days in which we can slaughter the animals, and some say there are 4. So what's your suggestion about this?
Actually, the Quran has specified this, that as long as the Hajis are in Mina, I mean, it's the time of Mina which is specified for sacrifice. So as long as they are there, I mean, the day that they depart from Mina is the time when it ends, and the day they land in Mina is the time when it starts.
Okay. Okay. The second question is, I have heard a video. I have seen a video on YouTube in which a religious scholar was saying that whenever you do the, the ghusl after.
Is this your second question, or this is a part of your?
Second question. The second question.
So I think.
I appreciate. Raised your hand again. So let's take the other participants who haven't been able to ask yet.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So Anayat, you are up next. So go ahead, ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Wa alaikum salam.
Sir, my question is regarding the intention while we sacrifice an animal. Do we have to recite it loud or just say in our heart?
Well, when you, if you're talking about the niyyah or the takbir, Bismillah, Allahu Akbar, it's of course if you can say it in your heart, it could be from your tongue. Both are okay, but do remember that this takbir actually signifies a very important part of our religion. That is, that it is a sanction from God to take the life of an animal. So Bismillah, Allahu Akbar is actually God's permission to you to take the life of the animal. If you don't do it, I mean, you can forget it, but that would not harm the sacrifice because it's always there in your heart. But people who don't take takbir or don't pronounce takbir, they are taking the life of an animal without any authorization from God. So that is why it is very important that you keep your wits about, that whenever you're slaughtering and sacrificing, then this is a very important thing. And in spite of that, of course, one can forget, but that is besides the point, as long as one makes an effort to remember this, to say it either in the heart or through the tongue.
Sir, actually I am from Kashmir, and when people sacrifice here, they recite this loud intention. They say, Inna salati wa nusuki wa mahyaya lillahi rabbil alameen. They recite a long verses, and then at last they say Bismillah, Allahu Akbar, and then they slaughter the animal. I don't know.
So, as far as the requirement from our religion is concerned, that is just Bismillah, Allahu Akbar. The rest is from their own self. And I think this is not the proper time also, because the animal is, ready for slaughter, and it has already seen the knife, and it's better to take the life as fast as possible, because you're going to torture the animal if you prolong it. So Bismillah, Allahu Akbar should be said very swiftly, and the slaughter should be done so that the animal does not get tortured.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. It seems like we are starting our second round of questions. So Ahmed Shoaib, please go ahead and ask. Thank you.
Yes, sir. I had a question about timing of Eid. So some people say that do it with Saudi, and also you in your yesterday's session said something like that, I think. I just wanted clarification, because the Eid al-Adha is technically supposed to be with Hajj. So should we do that one with Saudi, and then the Eid al-Fitr with our own country, and then shouldn't the entire calendar be with Saudi, because then it gets messed up and everything like that?
So I think that first of all we need to understand that we should follow the dictate of our country. If you're living in a Muslim country, of course, they have to announce Eid. But if you're living in a non-Muslim country, then the problem, in fact, is there, because who to follow and who not to follow. But if you ask my opinion, I would say that as far as Eid al-Adha is concerned, because it directly relates to worship ritual, which is Hajj, which goes on in Arabia. So I think just for the Eid al-Adha, we should follow the time of the calendar of Arabia, just for Eid al-Adha. The rest, of course, is something that we could just perceive the way we are, and without changing the calendar. What we can do is that we do the sacrifice act. If, for example, if it's on our 8th Zilhajj and it is 9th there, we can do it on 8th, because it's not that we are doing it on 8th of Zilhajj, or we are doing it on the 10th of Zilhajj, for example, not the 8th or 9th. Then this is something which is the day of Qurbani, or the day of Eid. So the day of Eid is something which is always done in areas where Hajj is not taking place, and that is only one place where Saudi Arabia is, of course. So on all other places, it should be the 10th of Zilhajj, according to what Arabia says is 10th of Zilhajj. But in all other cases, like for example Eid al-Fitr, or maybe the rest of the calendar, I think moon sighting or moon calculation or any other way in which the new month can be calculated and ascertained should be followed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, and don't hesitate to raise your hand again if you have another question. Next is Samin and Mamin.
Assalamualaikum. My question is that oftentimes when I face people who associate terrorist groups with Islam, I often say that I don't think that they're true Muslims, because their acts are far from peaceful, and what they do is against what Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, states and preaches. So is that a correct response, or am I...
Well, it's not very accurate, because you see, the Prophet did order for the killing of people, and the Almighty did so. So the only thing is that this was the prerogative of messengers of God. So perhaps you can amend your answer by telling or by saying that a person is a good Muslim or a right Muslim if he is true to what he believes. You see, whatever I believe, if I am true to my belief, hopefully God will view me as a sincere person, because I cannot judge other people by my standards. When I call someone a bad Muslim, I am actually judging him by saying, well, he's doing something wrong. Whereas if he is citing religion as a source, I mean, if he was citing some personal revenge or vendetta, of course, that would something be very different. But if he's citing the Qur'an or Hadith, and we differ with that person, and we think that it's a wrong interpretation, but remember, he is being true to his own interpretation, then what we'll do is we say that we don't agree with that person, but at the same time, we think that if he is doing something out of sincerity and out of his own knowledge, his matter is left to God. So you can express your difference of opinion, but I think saying that that person is not a true Muslim, is not a Muslim, that would be, I mean, it's crossing the limits.
Okay.
You can express your difference. I mean, you can express your difference of opinion. You say, I don't agree with that person. I totally condemn what he or she is doing. But at the same time, I give that person the latitude and the leverage to believe what he or she does and act upon it.
Thank you. Minnie, you are up next. Go ahead.
So my question is, why didn't anyone correct Osama bin Laden when he decided to become a terrorist? And if killing, like in the Quran, it also says that taking one life is like taking all of humanity's life. So how is that okay? Like, why didn't anyone tell him to not do that?
So see, these are two different things. When you kill someone wrongfully, I mean, you kill an innocent person without any reason. That's a separate thing, and that is where this verse applies. That you kill when you kill one person, you kill whole mankind. These are other directives which are given for war. You see, there are peacetime directives and there are war directives. So the wartime directives are that when a person loses this immunity because of certain acts, for example, he denies God, he does not accept God, then that immunity is lifted from him, and then there is a separate law which comes into action. And as far as that correction part is concerned, how could have anyone corrected him? Because many people still think that what he did, I mean the religious people, what he did was right, or at least they would silently support him if they are not very vocal. And people who were tried to, there were people, I mean, who criticized. For example, my own teacher, and there are some other people who, one of the people who got killed. I just mentioned that two of my colleagues were killed. So one of them was a very vocal a critic of these Taliban and Osama bin Laden, and he was telling them that these suicide bombings and these taking of innocent lives is absolutely against the Quran. And he had, I mean, he had left nothing unturned, no stone unturned. He was so vocal on the TV, in the press, in the social media, everywhere. And he just met his fate as a result.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Then we'll take question from you now.
I have another question regarding this idea of engaging in discourse with Westerners and people who have some sort of stereotypical view on Islam. So I feel like I find it hard to argue with this overwhelming kind of narrative in Western society that Islam is oppressive towards its minorities, and it's very rigid and not open to critical view, as we see in, for example, in Pakistan, where there's being forceful marriages of Hindu girls to Muslim people, and people show these kind of examples. And so my question kind of is that when there's so many overwhelming examples of, as I say, like kind of oppression in Muslim countries, which Westerners see as kind of a oppression of minorities and showing how Islam is backward, etc., etc., then how do we approach that discourse, and how do we try and change that kind of view, that, well, not necessarily change that view, but how do we discuss when people have such a strong narrative like that? Because I feel that if we just say that, oh, they're not Muslims, I feel like that's not very constructive.
So what you can do is tell them that don't learn Islam from Muslims, learn Islam from the Quran and the sources. Because it's not always necessary that Muslims are acting according to what Islam is. This is very true regarding other religions as well. So don't learn Christianity from Christians, learn it from the Bible. Don't learn what is Hinduism from Hindus, learn it from the Veds. Because you see, what happens is the message of a religion is enshrined in a book, which is the source of that religion. If people are distorting that or not acting upon it, it's not the fault of that religion, because as God has said, He does not force people to accept certain things. He just presents His books so that people can follow it out of their own will. And the second point that you can make is that this is just happening in the last couple of years in a country like Pakistan and some other countries. Otherwise, if you read history, you will find the accounts of non-Muslims telling us that the most protected minority, as far as they are concerned, was in the times when Islam was, for example, in Spain, or when Islam was ruling half the world. So they considered themselves to be the most protected minority. For example, Christians say that they found themselves more protected amongst living as minorities amongst Muslims than under any other religion. So it's not, I mean, it's not just simple that you just cite these marriages or some other thing which go on in the last 30-40 years, but because remember that the last 30-40 years cannot be made as an example because of the fact that the rise of this militancy, the rise of this extremist mindset has taken place in the last 40 or 50 years. This was not the case earlier on. And you can tell them and ask them to read history and read the testimonials of people of other religion who have actually emphatically said, there are books and books written on these topics which explain that how protected they felt and how good they felt living amongst Muslims. And they went even as far as to say, for example, there is this famous incident or this famous term which is called Shurbul Yuhud. This was the fact that in Islamic times, the Jews were allowed to manufacture, some of the Jews, of course, not all of them, because not all of them drink. So some of them, they would be allowed to manufacture alcohol. And they would have separate factories in separate areas within an Islamic empire, which they could actually do so and consume it. And this was a concession given to them. Similar was their marriage courts. They were given this opportunity to marry off the way they would like to marry off, not follow the custom of the Muslims. So the famous incident is that the Shurbul Yuhud, or liquor drinking of Jews, this became a term. And what Muslims would do, they would slip away in the areas of Jews, have a sip there, have some drink there, and just come back. And they would, and this actually was termed as Shurbul Yahud, which meant that, well, a Muslim is actually making use of the fact that, in spite of the fact that he is prohibited to drink, but what he does is he goes to a non-Muslim territory of that, of that same area, satisfies his drinking lust, and then comes back. So our religion went as far as to allow this, although it thinks it is prohibited that we consume alcohol. So there are so many examples in history that can be cited, and I think you just need to Google and you'll find out that this is not the case. This case that you have referred to has only arisen in the last 40 years with the rise of militancy.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. Hamza Ahmed, you are up next.
Thank you. Sir, I have seen a video on YouTube in Islamic scholars saying that whenever we do the obligatory ghusl after ejaculation, we should put water in our nose as deep as possible. So as in our medical science, we know that there is a danger of water going into the lungs, and as a result the person can die. So why Islam is stressing on putting water as deep as possible in the nose?
No, this is not Islam stressing. This is some Muslim stressing, because this is what not Islam has ever said. Cleaning the nose, even in wuzu, is not an obligation. The Prophet did this, cleaning the nose and his mouth, as his own personal example, because he wanted to, remain very clean. This was his idea. But this fact that someone is telling us that you should put water in your mouth, or pour water in your mouth as far as you can, it has no basis. Again, this is a case of the same thing which I just discussed, that learn Islam not from people who present Islam or represent Islam, but from its own sources.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Ahmed Shoaib, you are next. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Sir, I'm not sure if the brother who asked me this was a Muslim or non-Muslim, but he said that in the Quran, where it says "La ikraha fi din, qad tabayyana rushd min al-ghayy," that if there's no compulsion, but then at the same time the Prophet ﷺ is saying, or God is saying, that if you don't accept religion, then you will die. So how is this no compulsion, but you will also die?
See, in the time of the prophets of God, this has an entirely different meaning. It means that accepting truth or accepting untruth is entirely up to you. Man sha'a falyumin, man sha'a falyakfur. It's not that God is forcing you to accept something. You have to accept something out of your own will. Nothing is being forced upon you. The consequence is inconsequential at the moment when these verses are being said. What is actually being implied is that you are not being forced to do something. You do it out of your own will, but you face the consequences if you do something wrong. So, la ikraha fi din only means that in the time of this trial and in the time of this period in which you have been given this opportunity to do whatever you like, it's entirely up to you. In the times of the messengers of God, of course, this time was shortened because that miniature day of judgment had to take place in this world. But for us, for example, for whom that greater day of judgment is yet to take place, we are given this leverage that in this time of test, God is not forcing us to accept what He is saying. He is telling us to accept it, whether we'd like it or not. But of course, la ikraha fi din does not reflect on the day of judgment or those lesser days of judgment which took place in the messengers of God, because this is primarily a verse which is meant in the period of opportunity which is given to people to select whatever they want for themselves.
And then they're also saying that if a person today came, his name was John, he said that God told me that you're rejecting my religion because you're being arrogant or stubborn. They say that the Prophet ﷺ himself exercised this will to say that, they say, what is like the proof that
The proof of what?
Ahmed, probably you can reiterate your question. There was some disconnection in the signal.
Sure. So they say that the Prophet ﷺ, he from himself, he just did this and there was no proof for his prophethood. So how can we prove this prophethood to them?
Well, that is another exercise. I mean, proving his prophethood and why he's a true prophet of God. That's of course something which can be discussed by any person. But as I said, this is something which you should always bear in mind, that every person, from where that person is coming. I mean, to prove that they were prophets of God and they existed. And for example, if there is a Christian who does believe in prophethood, he does believe in Jesus and he does believe in the previous prophets, but he's not believing in the final prophet, the rationale or the argument or the line of argument would be different. And it would be different from people who do not believe in God or who do not believe in the prophets of God at all. So you see, you have to first find out where that person is coming from, where his background is, what exactly is his problem. So unless more details are given, I can just give you this principal answer that every person has to be tackled vis-a-vis the place from which he is actually asking that question.
Okay, thank you.
And please go ahead, ask your question.
Sir, I have this question regarding the Hagia Sofia mosque. Imam delivered his Friday sermon while holding a sword in his hand. I want to know your views about that.
Well, as I said, I am not even in favor of that mosque. I mean, that place being converted into a mosque. I don't know why he held that sword. It was absolutely needless. If I didn't see that, it's information for me coming from you. I would say that we need to first ask them why did they do so. But apparently, it is something which is very misplaced, and unless I mean, you cannot condemn a person or criticize a person unless you've heard what he or she has to say. So I'd first like to know why he did so, and only then can I comment.
Thank you, sir.
Ibrahim Malik, you have been waiting for long, so please go ahead, ask your question.
Yes, thank you. My question is a little bit off topic because I personally love art. I love drawing, and I love drawing superheroes and that typical teenage stuff. So I've searched a lot of this on YouTube, a lot of sheikhs and stuff, but all of them are contradicting. And I've asked a lot of people, and I don't know if they are true. I have heard a lot of people say that art is haram, drawing people is haram, drawing eyes is haram, drawing art itself is haram. So what are your views about it?
Well, I mean, I think a couple of weeks ago I did take up this topic as a full-fledged segment. You can maybe hear it out then, I mean, from that place. But to give you a brief answer, I don't agree with this, that art is prohibited at all. The only form of art which is prohibited is if it is vulgar or if it invokes sentiments of polytheism. For example, in the times of the Prophet's times, these statues and these pictures would be painted of the idols which would be worshipped, and people would think that they are living beings. And the Prophet actually said that, well, it is such statues and such pictures which you tend to worship, and you think that they are idols and they are statues which are of divine nature. You should not draw them, you should not make them. So this prohibition only relates to such pictures and idols. As far as drawing is concerned, like you draw a scenery or even your father or mother or portrait, or you take a picture of them, you draw a picture of them, it has nothing to do with the prohibition which is mentioned in certain narratives, which I said is specifically meant for those idols and images which are made for the purpose of worship.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Minnie, please go ahead, ask your question.
Thank you. I was wondering what exactly is the Arabia that you talked about? Like, what countries constituted it, and were they the same countries at the time of Prophet?
I think if you have a map of Arabia, except for the southern part, which is Yemen, all the rest of the Arabian Peninsula is Arabia, which includes, of course,
like Muscat
right,
is not going to be included either?
I mean, which place?
Muscat, Bahrain, Qatar.
I mean, you just look at the map and you find a way where that Arabian boundary is. Anything beyond that boundary, like those islands, they'll not be included. But things which are within that peninsula, except for Yemen, they are part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We would love to hear from Ahmed Shoaib again. Ahmed, please go ahead.
Sir, I just have a question regarding the fourth topic. People extrapolate from Surah Nur that the ones who guide their private parts. I've read up on this and that there's some sort of suppressed meaning that it talks about something else. Could you just explain that, please?
What is the suppressed meaning?
That it was something like they protect their private parts except from
Lal.
engaging with
No,
someone else.
actually, this is something which relates to the fact that they do not indulge in extramarital relations. There is no other person involved except for their wives, or in the times of the Prophet, their slave ladies, because they were allowed for a very specific period of time. So it does not at all talk about masturbation or self gratification. It talks about that when they satisfy their needs through an external person, through a second person, then that is the wife. This is like saying that whenever a second person is involved, it has to be the wife. But that does not mean that when you're alone or when there is another person that is being prohibited. So guarding the private parts in itself is something that you don't make a show of them. You don't, make them prominent. So yahfazna furujahun or yahfizu furujahum, all these terms which are mentioned in the Quran, they actually mean that they do not display them. They do not make their contours and their physical form apparent to the opposite gender or to other people. So protection here is not used in the Urdu meaning of protection, the way we think that we are stopping somewhere. In Arabic, when we say hafaza or hafiza, it means that you are actually not, in this context especially, yahfuzu furujahum, it means that you are not displaying your private parts or not have the intention of displaying them. You are wearing proper clothes, and these clothes, they hide your private parts, because we know that there are clothes who still don't hide your private parts because of the way they are worn. So that is the whole context. And as far as the fact is concerned, that illa ala azwajihim, which means that they do not do so with some external agency, that is only used when someone else is involved in satisfying your sexual need. And it is said when someone else is involved, it can only be your wife. It has nothing to do with the topic that we are discussing.
So it's clothing basically. There's no.
So there are two things. Yahfazna furujahum, which is the part which is discussed in Surah Nur. It is without the proposition ala. In the case of ala, which of course exists in Surah Mawrid and Mu'minun, which says illa ala azwajihim aw ma malakat. They have different meanings on both places. In the place of Surah Nur, it only means that you should not display your private parts so that they become visible. That's a separate meaning. In the case of Surah Ma'arij and Mu'minun, where the word hafaza occurs with the preposition Allah, it means that when they satisfy their sexual lust through a second party, that second party has to be the wife and no one else. Of course, as I said, the slave lady, which was allowed for a certain period of time in those times too, but there can be no other third party except these two. It cannot be any extramarital relation.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another question by Minnie. Minnie, please go ahead.
Thank you.
So I think we have a competition between Minnie and Shoaib, Ahmed Shoaib. Let's see who wins.
I was wondering about the use of sexual toys for like either in your marriage or for masturbation. Like, what's the ruling on that?
There's nothing wrong with them if they are not against your health, or if they are not nothing which injure you or they cause any sort of thing which is against your health. Otherwise, there's nothing wrong with them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was our last question. We had one written question which was already been answered by the participant. It was regarding allowing non-Muslims to visit mosques. So I believe there is no explanation required in that regard. So wishing all the participants and Dr. Shehzad a very happy Eid in advance.
Thank you.
And I'll hand it over to you if you have anything to say, and then we can conclude our session.
So inshallah, we'll be meeting 2 weeks from now, and have a lovely Eid. Enjoy your Eid, And do remember that even in this Eid, you have to be careful regarding the circumstances you are in. And any of one of you who is doing Qurbani, or his father or mother or someone close is doing Qurbani, just revise what we just discussed, that basically animal sacrifice is not meant to distribute meat. It is basically your vow to God that if your own life is needed some time, you'll not abstain. So we're very happy Eid to all of you. Inshallah, see you after 2 weeks. So Eid Mubarak.
Thank you so much.
In advance.
Eid Mubarak.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.